Picture this: a sprawling parchment map, its edges curling with age, dotted with dragons lurking in uncharted seas, and fantastical beasts prowling the blank spaces beyond known lands. This was the medieval world, as many imagined it, a place where the unknown was filled with myth and mystery. But what if I told you that these very maps, once crowded with creatures of legend, began to change, not because the monsters disappeared, but because brave souls dared to venture beyond the edges? Imagine the shock, the wonder, as travelers returned with tales of real cities, real people, and landscapes that defied every expectation. This is the story of how medieval Europe's understanding of the world exploded, not through magic, but through the courage of explorers, the hustle of merchants, and the quiet exchange of ideas along winding trade routes. Think about the sheer audacity it took to set sail into waters marked, "Here be dragons," or to trek across deserts where no one knew what or who lay on the other side. Every journey was a leap of faith, and each return trip carried back something priceless: knowledge, spices from the East, silks from the Orient, manuscripts preserving the wisdom of ancient scholars. These weren't just goods or texts. They were puzzle pieces, slotting together to reveal a world far larger, far stranger, and far more connected than anyone had dreamed. And with every new discovery, the old maps had to be redrawn, not just with ink, but with the stories of those who'd seen the impossible become real. So how did these journeys reshape the medieval mind? How did a monk in Paris suddenly find himself reading a text translated from Arabic, or a Venetian merchant learn to haggle in languages he'd never heard as a child? This video is your time machine, your ticket to an era where every voyage was a revolution, where the world grew wider with each ship that left harbor and each caravan that vanished over the horizon. We'll trace the footsteps of explorers who defied the unknown, unpack the trade routes that became lifelines of culture, and uncover how curiosity didn't just change maps, it changed history. Strap in, the adventure begins now. Before the great age of exploration, the medieval world was a place of walls, not just stone ones around cities, but walls in the mind. Picture a Europe where most people never traveled more than a few miles from their birthplace, where the shape of the earth wasn't a question but a certainty handed down from ancient authorities. Scholars pored over texts like Ptolemy's Geography, a work over 1,000 years old by the Middle Ages, which described a world neatly divided into 3 continents: Europe, Asia, and Africa, ringed by an endless, unnavigable ocean. Maps like the famous Hereford Mappa Mundi weren't just navigation tools, they were moral landscapes, with Jerusalem at the center and paradise tucked somewhere in the distant east. The edges of these maps bled into the unknown, scribbled with warnings like "Here be dragons," or decorated with races of monstrous men, dog-headed cynosfolly, one-footed skyopods, and tribes who lived on the scent of apples alone. This wasn't just ignorance, it was a world you stitched together from fragments of classical knowledge, biblical stories, and sheer necessity. If you'd asked a medieval scholar whether the earth was flat, they might have shrugged. The real fear wasn't falling off the edge, it was what lay beyond the edges of Christendom. The unknown wasn't just empty space, it was a realm where the rules broke down, where the air might poison you or the sun burn you black. When travelers like Marco Polo returned with tales of paper money in China or coconuts that tasted like milk, they were met with disbelief. These stories clashed with everything Europe thought it knew. Yet cracks in this world began to show in unexpected ways. Merchants trading along the Silk Road didn't just bring back silks and spices. They carried whispers of distant cities where scholars preserved Greek text Europe had lost. Jewish and Muslim mapmakers in places like Al-Andalus drew coastlines with startling accuracy, while Norse sagas told of lands west of Greenland where grapes grew wild. Even the Church, which had long insisted on a fixed, ordered universe, couldn't ignore the flood of new knowledge forever. By the 13th century, friars like William of Rubruck were traveling to the court of the Mongol Empire and writing accounts that read like adventure novels full of frozen rivers wider than countries, palaces lined with silver, and debates between Christians, Buddhists, and Muslims under the open sky. The old maps didn't vanish overnight, but with every caravan that returned, every ship that limped home with tales of new coasts, the dragons retreated a little further into the margins. What replaced them was something far more dangerous, not monsters but questions. If the world wasn't what the ancients had described, what else might be out there? And if a humble merchant could cross continents, what else might be possible? The age of exploration didn't begin with a single voyage. It began the moment someone looked at a map and realized the blank spaces weren't warnings. They were invitations. Pilgrimage wasn't just a spiritual journey, it was medieval Europe's first mass tourism industry, a phenomenon that sent thousands of ordinary people trekking across continents with nothing but faith and a crude wooden staff. Imagine a farmer who'd never left his village, walking for months through bandit-infested forests and foreign kingdoms, all to kneel before a relic in a cathedral halfway across the world. This wasn't just devotion, it was a radical act of exploration. The roads to Jerusalem, Rome, and Santiago de Compostela became medieval superhighways, crowded with pilgrims swapping stories, bartering for food, and accidentally creating the first networks of cross-cultural exchange. Take Marjorie Kemp, a fiery mystic from England who dictated her travels in what's considered the first autobiography in English. Her account reads like a medieval travel vlog, full of storms at sea, confrontations with suspicious customs officials, and moments of raw wonder, like the time she wept uncontrollably at the Church of the Holy Sepulchre. But Kemp wasn't just sightseeing. Every shrine she visited, every fellow pilgrim she met, chipped away at the idea that the world was small and knowable. When she described the bustling markets of Venice or the strange customs of Baltic traders, she wasn't just sharing gossip. She was mapping a world far more complex than her neighbors back home could fathom. The risks were real. Pilgrims faced shipwrecks, highway robbery, and diseases from drinking bad water. Many never returned, yet the rewards went beyond spiritual merit. A pilgrim might bring back Venetian glass beads as proof of their journey, only to have a local merchant recognize them as something traded from even farther east. The scallop shells worn by those who reached Santiago became status symbols, medieval versions of "I climbed Mount Everest" t-shirts, sparking curiosity about the lands where such wonders existed. Even the routes themselves transformed. What began as paths to salvation became dotted with hostels, money changers, and markets, slowly evolving into the trade arteries that would later fuel Europe's commercial revolution. The real revelation wasn't just discovering new places, but realizing how many people already lived there. A pilgrim expecting to find Jerusalem populated solely by biblical ghosts instead encountered a thriving mosaic of Jews, Muslims, and Eastern Christians, all with their own maps, their own stories. Suddenly, the world wasn't a static backdrop for scripture. It was alive, shifting, full of voices that didn't fit neatly into medieval Europe's mental categories. By the time the last scallop shell was pinned to a returning pilgrim's cloak, the old maps weren't just inaccurate, they were irrelevant. And as these footsore travelers trickled home, their tales turned ancient trade routes into something new, highways not just for goods but for ideas. Silk wasn't just a luxury, it was a revolution disguised as fabric. When caravans lumbered along the Silk Road, their bundles held more than gleaming textiles. They carried the DNA of civilizations colliding. Picture a single bolt of Chinese silk reaching Rome. To the wearer, it was just a status symbol, but to history, it was a thread stitching together worlds. The same routes that transported spices from Malacca to Marseille delivered something far more volatile: ideas. A Persian merchant might trade a sack of pepper for Venetian glass, but in the smoky taverns of Constantinople, he'd also share news of Arabic numerals revolutionizing bookkeeping, or describe how Chinese doctors used pulsing veins to diagnose illness. These weren't just transactions, they were silent classrooms where the curriculum was the entire known world. Venice didn't rise to power by accident. Perched between East and West, the city became a living encyclopedia of global knowledge. Its docks bristled with ships unloading Egyptian cotton, Indian diamonds, and Byzantine mosaics, while its markets echoed with a dozen languages haggling over prices and philosophies. When Marco Polo returned from Cathay with tales of coal burning hotter than wood and paper money lighter than coins, skeptics called him a liar. But Venetian bankers recognized genius. Soon, double-entry bookkeeping, borrowed from Arab traders, would transform Europe's economy. Even something as mundane as a spinning wheel traveled from India to Italy via these routes, doubling textile production and quietly sparking proto-industrial revolutions in wool towns from Flanders to Florence. Constantinople was the grand crossroads where nothing ever stayed foreign for long. Walk its streets in the 12th century, and you'd pass Armenian jewelers, Norse mercenaries, and Persian astronomers debating celestial navigation over cups of Turkish coffee, a drink that hadn't yet reached Parisian cafes. The city's great palace housed a mechanical throne that roared like a lion, engineered by Arab craftsmen, while its hospitals employed surgical techniques recorded in Sanskrit texts. When Crusaders sacked the city in 1204, they didn't just loot gold, they accidentally liberated libraries full of Greek classics Europe had forgotten, preserved by Muslim scholars. The tragedy: it took violence to rediscover what trade had already delivered peacefully for centuries. Spices did more than flavor food, they rewired European brains. Before pepper and cinnamon arrived via the Malabar coast, medieval cuisine was a bland affair of salted meat and stale bread. But with each shipload from Alexandria came unexpected side effects. Cloves introduced antiseptic properties to medicine, nutmeg sparked new theories about humoral balance, and the sheer cost of saffron funded entire universities. A single cargo of peppercorns could buy a Florentine mansion, but the real wealth lay in the knowledge stowed between crates, like the Arabic medical texts describing how to sterilize wounds with alcohol, or the Chinese compasses that made Atlantic voyages possible. The Amber Road, stretching from the Baltic to the Adriatic, proves trade wasn't always about the exotic. Northern Europe's golden fossil resin reached Egyptian pharaohs and Mycenaean kings millennia before Vikings walked the earth. But amber's true magic wasn't its beauty, it was its role as a cultural courier. Buried within its honey-colored depths were clues to lost ecosystems, inspiring early paleontological theories. When Germanic tribes traded it southward, they inadvertently created a highway for metallurgy secrets. Hungarian swordsmiths incorporated Baltic iron techniques, while Etruscan artisans adapted Celtic patterns. Even plague traveled these routes, but so did cures. Byzantine doctors fleeing outbreaks brought Greek medical texts to monasteries in Poland, where monks painstakingly copied them alongside local herbal remedies. The greatest commodity traded wasn't something you could weigh or touch. When Mongol horsemen unified Eurasia under the Pax Mongolica, they didn't just secure caravan routes, they unleashed an information superhighway. Persian astronomers in Samarkand shared star charts with Chinese scholars, while Venetian merchants in Tabriz learned about gunpowder from Sichuan engineers. A single Franciscan friar traveling under Mongol protection could carry Buddhist meditation techniques to Parisian theologians and return with sketches of Gothic cathedrals that would inspire Persian mosque architecture. This was globalization's beta test, proving that once knowledge starts moving, it refuses to stay within borders. The next time you look at a world map, remember, those lines marking nations are an illusion. The real connections were, and still are, the invisible roads where ideas hitch rides on the backs of camels. While Europe was still piecing together fragments of lost classical knowledge, the Islamic world was building libraries that could hold the entire cosmos. In Baghdad, the Abbasid Caliphate didn't just preserve ancient Greek and Roman texts, they supercharged them. Picture the House of Wisdom, a 9th century intellectual powerhouse where Christian, Jewish, and Muslim scholars worked side by side, translating Aristotle into Arabic, refining Ptolemy's star charts, and debating medicine over cups of kahwa, the drink we now call coffee. This wasn't just storage, it was a full-scale Renaissance centuries before Europe's. Manuscripts that had gathered dust in Byzantine monasteries were now being annotated with breakthroughs in algebra by scholars like Al-Khwarizmi, whose name gave us the word algorithm. Take Al-Idrisi, the Moroccan geographer who crafted a silver world map for the Norman King Roger Roman II of Sicily. While European maps still showed Jerusalem as the center of a flat earth, Al-Idrisi's work incorporated accounts from traders who'd sailed the Indian Ocean and crossed the Sahara. His maps were so accurate that when Crusaders stumbled upon them, they realized with shock that the Holy Land wasn't the edge of the world, just one stop on a globe crisscrossed with thriving trade routes. Medicine leaped forward in ways that saved millions. Ibn Sina's Canon of Medicine became Europe's medical textbook for 500 years, teaching techniques like quarantine and anesthesia. In Cordoba, surgeons were removing cataracts with hollow needles while London barbers still doubled as dentists. And when the Black Death hit, it was Arabic medical tracts smuggled into Sicily that first suggested germ theory, centuries before microscopes could prove it. Astronomy flourished under the dome of the Samarkand Observatory, where Ulugh Beg calculated the length of a year to within seconds. His star tables were so precise that Copernicus would later crib them for his heliocentric model. Even something as mundane as your morning coffee owes its European debut to these exchanges. Venetian merchants first encountered the drink in Mamluk Cairo, where scholars swore it sharpened the mind for all-night study sessions. The real game changer, translation. As Christian kingdoms pushed into Al-Andalus, they found Toledo's libraries overflowing with Arabic versions of Greek classics Europeans thought were lost forever. Scholars like Gerard of Cremona worked feverishly to translate them into Latin, often via a linguistic relay: Greek to Syriac to Arabic to Spanish to Latin. Imagine Euclid's geometry returning to Europe via this dizzying chain, now sprinkled with Arab commentaries that solved problems Archimedes had left unfinished. When Crusaders sacked Jerusalem in 1099, they were after relics, not textbooks. Yet in their looting, they accidentally shipped home Arabic medical manuals alongside stolen gold. Knights Templar recovering from wounds began demanding treatments their Arab doctors had used, like sterilized bandages and dietary regimens. Back in Venice, merchants realized the real treasure wasn't in the Holy Land's churches, but in the docks of Alexandria, where crates of Arabic texts could be resold to Bologna's budding universities for a fortune. This collision of worlds set the stage for an even greater upheaval. As Europe's scholars pored over these rediscovered texts, a dangerous question took root. If the ancients had been wrong about medicine, geography, and the stars, what else might they have missed? The answer would send ships sailing beyond the horizon, not just to reclaim holy cities, but to rewrite the map of human knowledge once and for all. The Crusades tore through medieval Europe and the Middle East like a storm, waves of violence that reshaped borders, toppled kingdoms, and left scars still visible today. But beneath the bloodshed, something unexpected was happening, a silent exchange of ideas that would alter the course of history. Picture a Templar knight, hardened by years of battle, returning home with more than just loot. In his saddlebags are Arabic medical texts, silk garments lighter than anything woven in Flanders, and a taste for spices that make his native cuisine seem bland. The very wars meant to divide Christendom and Islam became accidental bridges between worlds. Take Frederick II, the Holy Roman Emperor who baffled his contemporaries. While other crusaders besieged cities, Frederick, fluent in Arabic, held court in Jerusalem, debating philosophy with Islamic scholars and marveling at their astronomical instruments. His men brought back Sicilian lemons from Damascus, introducing citrus to European orchards, while Arab engineers taught his architects how to build vaulted ceilings that defied gravity. The castle he erected in southern Italy, Castel del Monte, wasn't just a fortress, it was a geometric puzzle, its octagonal design echoing Islamic mathematical precision. The spoils of war weren't just gold and relics. When Crusaders sacked Constantinople in 1204, they didn't realize the greatest treasure wasn't the jewels, it was the libraries. Greek texts on medicine, long forgotten in Europe but preserved in Arabic translations, began filtering back to universities in Paris and Bologna. A single manuscript of Galen's works, annotated by Persian physicians, could revolutionize how European doctors understood anatomy. Even the humble windmill, a Middle Eastern invention, spread across France and England thanks to returning soldiers who'd seen them grinding grain in the Levant. Food tells its own story of collision. Sugar, once a rare luxury imported in tiny cones by Venetian merchants, became a Crusader obsession after they saw vast plantations in Syria. Returning knights brought back apricots from Armenia, spinach from Persia, and the habit of ending meals with something sweet, a radical break from Europe's bread and porridge monotony. The word sugar itself entered European languages via Arabic, just like algebra, zenith, and mattress. Architecture absorbed these exchanges like sandstone soaking up desert rain. Gothic cathedrals began sporting pointed arches, a design borrowed from Syrian mosques that distributed weight more efficiently. Stained glass techniques, perfected in Egyptian workshops, transformed sunlight into divine storytelling. Even the concept of hospitals as places of healing, not just Christian charity, came from Islamic models where Jewish, Christian, and Muslim doctors worked side by side. The ultimate irony, the Crusades failed militarily but succeeded culturally. As knights straggled home, they carried scraps of knowledge that would ignite Europe's imagination. Arabic numerals replaced clumsy Roman ones, making banking possible. The astrolabe, refined by Moorish astronomers, allowed sailors to venture beyond coastal waters. And tucked between the lines of translated texts lay a dangerous idea. That truth wasn't the sole property of the Church, but something to be sought whether in ancient scrolls, foreign laboratories, or the stars themselves. This slow drip of borrowed brilliance didn't just change Europe, it set the stage for an explosion. When a young scholar named Thomas Aquinas began reconciling Aristotle's logic with Christian theology in the 13th century, he was building on commentaries written in Arabic centuries earlier. The Renaissance wasn't a sudden rebirth, it was the fruit of centuries of uneasy exchange, sown in the blood-soaked soil of the Crusades. The ships that would later sail to the New World weren't just powered by wind. They were propelled by ideas that had crossed deserts on camelback, survived sieges, and emerged stronger than anyone could have imagined. Marco Polo's journey began as a teenage adventure, a 17-year-old Venetian trailing his merchant father and uncle across deserts so vast, he later swore they'd seen ghosts shimmering in the heat. By the time he returned 24 years later, he'd witnessed wonders that made European courts question whether he'd visited another world entirely. His account, The Travels of Marco Polo, wasn't just a memoir, it was a bombshell dropped on medieval Europe's imagination. Picture the reaction when he described cities where people burned black rocks, coal for fuel, or used paper instead of gold to buy goods. To Venetians accustomed to heavy coin purses, the idea of lightweight currency seemed like sorcery. And then there was the Grand Canal, a waterway so colossal, it made the Thames look like a village creek, thronged with thousands of ships carrying silks, spices, and porcelain to a capital grander than any in Christendom. Not every detail was strictly accurate. Polo likely never governed the Chinese city of Yongzhou as he claimed, and his description of Japan as a land paved with gold was more rumor than fact. But these exaggerations weren't lies, they were symptoms of a mind struggling to translate the unimaginable. How do you explain gunpowder to someone who's never seen an explosion? Polo called it a black powder that burns with a noise like thunder, leaving readers to fill in the gaps with their own terror. His account of Kublai Khan's postal system, a network of relay stations stretching thousands of miles, where riders could swap horses and race fresh dispatches, sounded like fantasy to Europeans still relying on lone couriers. Yet these weren't fairy tales, they were glimpses of an administrative efficiency Europe wouldn't match for centuries. The book's legacy wasn't just in its facts, but in its omissions. Polo barely mentioned the Great Wall, skipped tea entirely, and described chopsticks as little sticks they eat with. But these gaps reveal something profound. Even the most observant traveler sees only fragments. What stuck wasn't the minutiae, it was the overwhelming scale of a civilization that dwarfed Europe's kingdoms. When Polo described Hangzhou's bustling markets, where 10,000 pounds of pepper traded daily, or the Khan's palace with its golden roofs and mechanical fountains, he wasn't just cataloging marvels. He was proving that the world's center of gravity lay far beyond Jerusalem or Rome. Christopher Columbus's battered copy, crammed with handwritten notes, tells you everything. The man who stumbled upon the Americas wasn't searching for a new world, he was chasing Polo's old one, convinced Cathay lay just beyond the horizon. That miscalculation changed history, but it also proved Polo's enduring power. His book became a mirror. Some saw cautionary tales of pagan wealth, others a roadmap to untapped markets. Merchants pored over his descriptions of Indian diamond mines and Sumatran camphor forests, while scholars debated whether his unicorns were really rhinoceroses. Even his errors, like placing Japan too far east, reshaped geography by pushing mapmakers to redraw the edges of the possible. Yet Polo was just one voice in a chorus of travelers rewriting Europe's mental atlas. While he wandered the courts of Kublai Khan, Berber scholar Ibn Battuta was chronicling his 30-year odyssey across Africa, Arabia, and beyond, his accounts of Timbuktu's golden mosques and Kilwa's coral palaces, proving that sophistication wasn't unique to the East. These parallel journeys, one heading toward the sunrise, the other deep into the African continent, shattered the old binary of civilized versus unknown. The world wasn't a ladder with Europe at the top, it was a web of interconnected marvels, each strand waiting to be followed. If Marco Polo was Europe's eyes on the East, Ibn Battuta was the globe's witness, a man who didn't just visit the world but seemed to walk through it like a living atlas. Born in Tangier in 1304, this Berber scholar set out at 21 for a pilgrimage to Mecca and didn't return home for 29 years. By then, he'd logged over 75,000 miles, 3 times Marco Polo's distance, crossing 40 modern countries, from the sweltering markets of Mali to the frosty peaks of the Hindu Kush. His memoir, The Rihla, isn't just a travelogue. It's a medieval Google Street View, capturing everything from the etiquette of Indian royal courts to the correct way to eat a mango. Picture the scene when Battuta arrived in Mali in 1352. Europe was reeling from the Black Death, but here was a kingdom where gold was so plentiful, the ruler casually handed out nuggets like candy. Mansa Musa's famous pilgrimage to Mecca decades earlier had already shattered myths about African barbarism, but Battuta's account gave texture to the legend. He described a court where poets performed in silken robes, where justice was measured out with iron precision, and where the university in Timbuktu buzzed with debates over astronomy and law. When he scoffed at local women's immodest dress going bare-breasted in the heat, he wasn't just moralizing, he was accidentally documenting a cultural norm that clashed with his Islamic upbringing. These weren't just observations, they were grenades tossed at European assumptions about Africa. India left him awestruck and terrified. Appointed as a judge in Delhi's Sultanate, Battuta witnessed a realm where elephants carried armies into battle and spices like cardamom and cloves were worth their weight in silver. His description of the Sultan's court reads like a thriller: political intrigues, sudden executions, and a ruler who once gifted him a fortune in gold coins, only to demand repayment weeks later. Yet even here, Battuta noticed details others missed: how Hindu astrologers predicted monsoons with eerie accuracy, or how Persian and Sanskrit medical texts sat side by side in royal libraries. His account of the Sultan's harem, where women debated philosophy and composed poetry, shattered stereotypes about gender in medieval societies. Then there were the Mongols. Unlike Polo, who saw their empire at its height, Battuta arrived as it frayed, yet even in decline, it dazzled. In Constantinople, he marveled at Hagia Sophia's dome, so vast it seemed suspended from heaven. In the steppes, he shared roasted lamb with nomads who traced their lineage to Genghis Khan, their yurts lined with Chinese silk. His description of the Yuan dynasty's collapse reads like breaking news: rebel armies, fleeing bureaucrats, and a postal system so efficient couriers could outrun rumors of war. What makes the Rihla indispensable isn't its accuracy. Battuta likely never reached China, despite claiming otherwise, but its kaleidoscopic perspective. When he describes Zanzibar's stilt houses or the Maldives' matriarchal judges, he's not just sightseeing, he's proving that the medieval world was anything but monolithic. His account of African kings trading gold for salt across the Sahara reveals an economic web stretching from the Mediterranean to the Niger Delta. And when he grumbles about the bland food in the Maldives, missing the spices of India, he's unwittingly tracing the contours of a global palate. Battuta's legacy lies in the questions he forces us to ask. If a lone traveler with a pen could document so much, what else flourished beyond Europe's gaze? The answer hums in the archives of Timbuktu, where Malian astronomers charted stars unseen in Ptolemy's maps, and in the coral stone ruins of Kilwa, where Swahili merchants kept ledgers in Arabic script. While Europe fixated on Jerusalem, African scholars in Zheng were compiling histories that stretched back to pharaohs their visitors had never heard of. The real medieval globe wasn't a collection of isolated civilizations. It was a symphony with melodies Battuta's ink helped preserve. And as his footsteps fade from the page, another truth emerges: the greatest journeys aren't just about distance. They're about listening to the world, one astonished scribble at a time. While Europe fixated on crusades and cathedrals, African empires were quietly building networks that stretched across hemispheres. The Kingdom of Ghana, flourishing as early as the 8th century, didn't just trade gold, it controlled it. Picture a realm where gold dust was so common, the king's courtiers carried swords sheathed in it, and dogs wore collars of hammered gold. But Ghana's real power wasn't in the metal itself, it was in the secrecy surrounding its source. Arab traders wrote of a land where nuggets the size of eggs were exchanged for salt in silent, shadowed markets, with deals struck by tapping coded rhythms on drums. The Sahara wasn't a barrier, it was a highway where camel caravans carried not just goods but innovations. Sudanese architectural techniques traveled north to Morocco, while Islamic scholarship seeped southward into bustling cities like Timbuktu. Then there was Mansa Musa, the Malian ruler whose 1,324 pilgrimage to Mecca rewrote the global economy overnight. Imagine a procession of 60,000 people, including 12,000 slaves, each carrying a 4-pound bar of gold, winding through Cairo. The emperor's generosity was so extravagant, distributing gold to beggars and building mosques along the route, that he accidentally crashed Egypt's gold market for a decade. Chroniclers gasped at his wealth, but they missed the real story. Musa wasn't just flaunting riches, he was showcasing a sophisticated state. His empire's gold mines fueled economies from Venice to Guangzhou, while Timbuktu's Sankore University became a beacon of learning, its libraries stocked with Greek texts preserved by Arab scholars and annotated in Songhai script. Students debated astronomy under roofs lined with manuscripts, proving Africa wasn't a passive recipient of knowledge, it was a crucible. Axum, in modern Ethiopia, played a different game. While Mali dazzled with gold, Axum thrived on trade diplomacy. Its obelisks, some towering 100 feet, weren't mere monuments, they were billboards advertising the kingdom's reach. Axumite coins bearing crosses and crescent moons circulated from India to Rome, signaling a kingdom that could speak the language of both Christian Byzantium and Hindu India. When the Prophet Muhammad's followers faced persecution, it was Axum's Christian king who granted them refuge, proving Africa's role as a mediator between worlds. The kingdom's greatest export, a quiet revolution in agriculture, the hardy teff grain, still the base of Ethiopian injera bread, spread to Yemen and beyond, while Axumite sailors introduced the concept of terraced farming to Arabian hillsides. The Swahili coast was where Africa met the Indian Ocean in a shimmering embrace. Cities like Kilwa and Mogadishu weren't just ports, they were cultural cocktails. Walk their streets in the 14th century, and you'd hear Bantu dialects peppered with Arabic, smell Persian saffron mingling with Madagascan vanilla, and see Chinese porcelain displayed in houses built with coral bricks. A single shard of Ming dynasty pottery found in Great Zimbabwe tells a story of trade routes stretching 8,000 miles. Even the infamous slave trade had unexpected dimensions here. While European slavery later industrialized brutality, Swahili merchants operated under strict Islamic laws. Enslaved people could own property, testify in court, and even purchase their freedom. This wasn't the transatlantic horror yet to come. It was a system so complex, it forces us to confront how definitions of slavery shifted across time and cultures. As African gold flowed north to mint European ducats and east to forge Indian rupees, another frontier was opening, this time in the frozen north. While Mansa Musa's gold caravans crossed deserts, Norse longships were slicing through Arctic waves, their dragon prows pointing toward horizons even Ptolemy hadn't dreamed of. The threads of connection were about to stretch farther than anyone imagined. The Viking longships cutting through North Atlantic fog weren't just vessels, they were time machines hurtling medieval Europe into a future it hadn't imagined. While most of Christendom still saw the ocean as a divine barrier, Norse sailors treated it like a highway, navigating by sunstones that polarized light and whale behavior that signaled nearby land. When they reached Iceland in the late 9th century, they didn't find an empty wilderness but Irish monks who'd already retreated from the pagan devils, arriving on dragon-proud ships. This wasn't just settlement, it was a collision of worlds, with Viking chieftains establishing the Althing, one of history's first parliaments, while volcanic eruptions turned the sky blood red back in Norway. Greenland became the ultimate medieval real estate gamble. Eric the Red, exiled for murder, branded its icy shores with a name so enticing, Greenland, that hundreds of families risked the voyage. For 4 centuries, Norse farms clung to fjords where cattle grazed on summer grass, while hunters returned with narwhal tusks sold in Europe as unicorn horns. The real shock came when a trader named Bjarni Herjolfsson, blown off course in 986, spotted forested hills far to the west. It was Leif Erikson who finally landed there around the year 1000, naming it Vinland for the wild grapes. At Elant's Ox Meadows in modern Newfoundland, archaeologists found Norse cloak pins and iron rivets, proof of a short-lived settlement where Vikings traded with indigenous Skraelings, likely the Thule ancestors of today's Inuit. The sagas describe everything from accidental drunkenness, Norse milk fermented with berries confused local tribes, to violent skirmishes over misunderstood trade gestures. Why did these toeholds vanish? Climate change played executioner. The Little Ice Age froze Viking shipping lanes, while Greenland's settlers, refusing to adopt Inuit seal hunting techniques, starved beside empty cattle pens. But their trade networks lived on like ghosts. Norse silver dirhams from Baghdad turned up in Maine, likely passed hand to hand from Labrador to Wabanaki traders. Walrus ivory from Greenland adorned cathedral altars in Florence, while polar bear pelts gifted to Holy Roman emperors became diplomatic sensations. The Vikings didn't just discover America, they wove it into a web of exchange stretching from Constantinople's bazaars to Mayan markets, where blue-eyed figurines suggest indirect contact. Medieval mapmakers struggled to reconcile these discoveries with their worldviews. The Vinland map, controversial but tantalizing, shows Greenland as a peninsula and hints at a landmass beyond it labeled Vinlanda Insula. Norse cosmology, with its serpent Jörmungandr encircling the Earth, gave way to practical portolan charts where Iceland anchored northern trade routes. By the time Columbus sailed, Danish fishermen were still whispering about the western lands, and Basque whalers may have followed their leads to Canadian waters. The real Viking legacy wasn't in lasting settlements, but in proving the ocean wasn't the end of the world, just the beginning of another. Medieval maps were never just tools for navigation. They were arguments about how the world worked. Early Mappa Mundi, like the Hereford map, drawn around 1300, showed Jerusalem at the center with paradise to the east and monstrous races lurking at the edges. These weren't meant to guide travelers, they were theological diagrams placing humanity between salvation and chaos. But as ships began venturing beyond familiar coasts, a quiet revolution unfolded in dimly lit scriptoriums and bustling port cities. Sailors needed charts that reflected reality, not doctrine, and the result was the portolan, a radical shift where coastlines bristled with precise angles and crisscrossing room lines. Suddenly, the Mediterranean wasn't a symbolic crescent, but a measurable space where traders could calculate distances from Barcelona to Alexandria by aligning compass roses. Arab cartographers had been working this way for centuries. Al-Idrisi's 12th century Tabula Rogeriana, crafted for the Norman king of Sicily, combined Ptolemy's grid system with first-hand accounts from Muslim merchants who'd sailed to the Malay archipelago. His maps flipped the traditional north-south orientation, placing south at the top, not an error, but a deliberate choice reflecting Islamic scholarship's view of the Indian Ocean as the world's commercial heart. When these works reached Europe via Al-Andalus, they introduced concepts like latitude zones and climatic theory, proving the Earth wasn't a flat disk but a sphere where weather patterns followed predictable rules. The Catalan Atlas of 1375, a masterpiece commissioned by King Peter Roman IV of Aragon, merged these traditions into something astonishing. Painted on 6 panels of vellum, it showed caravan routes snaking across the Sahara to Mali's gold fields, and ship lanes threading past the Azores Islands Europeans had only recently stumbled upon. Mansa Musa glimmers in the center of Africa, holding a golden orb, while Marco Polo's Cathay appears in the Far East with annotations about paper currency and gunpowder. This wasn't just a map, it was a visual encyclopedia of global exchange, where knowledge from Norse sagas, Arab star charts, and Genos merchant logs collided. Yet old myths died hard. Even as portlands improved, some cartographers clung to legends, slipping sea monsters into the Atlantic or marking the location of Prester John's mythical Christian kingdom. The Fra Mauro map of 1459 boldly declared, "Here is not the work of Ptolemy near its empty southern edges," a confession that ancient authorities no longer held all the answers. Slowly, the dragons retreated, replaced by blank spaces labeled terra incognita, not warnings but invitations. Gerardus Mercator's 16th century projection, though technically post-medieval, grew from this ferment. His grid of perfect right angles solved a practical problem: how to represent a spherical world on flat paper for sailors. But the cost was distortion. Greenland ballooned to the size of Africa, while Europe sat smugly at the center. These choices weren't neutral, they mirrored the era's shifting power dynamics, where knowledge wasn't just recorded but weaponized. What's often overlooked is how ordinary people consumed these changes. Travelogues like Mandeville's fictional adventures packed with cannibals and fountain of youth myths outsold factual accounts for centuries. A Florentine merchant might own an accurate portolan for work, but his children would gawk at illuminated manuscripts showing Alexander the Great hoisted by griffins into the sky. The tension between what was known and what was imagined fueled an appetite for exploration that went beyond gold or God. It was about filling in the blanks where the monsters used to be. And as these maps spread, so did an unsettling thought. If the world was so much larger than anyone had dreamed, what else might be waiting beyond the next horizon? The Travels of Sir John Mandeville was the medieval equivalent of a blockbuster part adventure novel, part fake news, and entirely irresistible. Penned anonymously in the mid-14th century, this wildly popular travelogue claimed to chronicle an English knight's journeys from Constantinople to the court of the Great Khan, with stops in lands where men had heads like dogs and rivers ran with precious stones. The catch: most of it was cobbled together from older texts, traveler rumors, and outright fabrications. Yet for 2 centuries, Europeans devoured these tales as gospel, proving that even in the Middle Ages, people loved a good story more than they worried about fact-checking. Mandeville's genius lay in his blend of the plausible and the fantastical. When he described the Sultan's palace in Cairo, a real place, he sprinkled in details like mechanical golden birds that sang, borrowed from Persian legends. His account of the earthly paradise, where aging reversed and wounds healed instantly, echoed ancient myths but was presented as eyewitness testimony. These weren't just lies, they were narrative alchemy, turning half-truths into something readers wanted to believe. Even his version of the Great Wall of China, which he called a barrier against Gog and Magog, mixed real geography with biblical prophecy. The result, a book so convincing that Christopher Columbus carried a heavily annotated copy, scribbling notes in the margins about where to find these marvels. The impact rippled far beyond entertainment. Mandeville's descriptions of India's wealth fueled Portugal's push to find sea routes, while his tales of Prester John's Christian kingdom in Africa sent missionaries trekking into the Ethiopian highlands. His claim that the earth was round, so that a man might go all about it, wasn't new, but coming from a traveler, it carried unexpected weight with ordinary readers. Yet for every kernel of truth, there were dangerous misconceptions. His insistence that the Caspian Sea was an ocean gateway to the East confused mapmakers for generations, and his racist caricatures of monstrous races justified colonial mindsets before Europe even had colonies. Monastic scholars faced a dilemma with such texts. In Chile scriptoriums, Benedictine monks painstakingly copied Manville alongside sober works like Isidore of Seville's etymologies, creating anthologies where fact and fantasy shared the same parchment. Some scribes added skeptical glosses. This seems improbable, while others embellished further. The real surprise, these monks weren't just passive copyists. Irish chroniclers comparing Manville with Viking sagas noticed discrepancies in descriptions of Asia's northern reaches, while German cartographers cross-referenced his accounts with Arabic maps stolen from Moorish libraries during the Reconquista. Slowly, a new kind of geography emerged, one where observation challenged tradition. By the 15th century, you could find Mandeville's book in merchants' chests, royal libraries, and even peasant cottages where someone might read it aloud by firelight. Its legacy wasn't in its accuracy, but in its audacity. For readers who'd never left their villages, these pages proved the world was stranger, wider, and more wondrous than priests or princes claimed. And when the first Portuguese caravels finally rounded Africa's coast, their captains weren't just looking for spices. They were searching for the impossible lands Manville had promised, and finding instead a truth far more extraordinary. While kings waged wars and merchants chased fortunes, Europe's monasteries hummed with a quieter revolution, the scratch of quills on parchment preserving civilizations from oblivion. Picture a Benedictine monk in a freezing scriptorium, his breath visible in the candlelight as he copies a crumbling Roman text. His numb fingers aren't just transcribing words, they're stitching together the frayed edges of history. In an age before printing presses, these cloistered scribes became the unsung librarians of the medieval world, rescuing Aristotle's logic from damp basements, Ptolemy's star charts from Attic mice, and Galen's medical wisdom from the teeth of time. Take Bede, the 7th century English monk who wrote history while history forgot his own face. No contemporary portrait survives. Jarrow Monastery's most famous scholar didn't just record dates, he redefined how time was measured. His ecclesiastical history of the English people wove oral traditions, royal genealogies, and Roman records into a coherent timeline, introducing the Anno Domini dating system we still use today. But Bede's real masterpiece was his On the Nature of Things, a pocket encyclopedia explaining everything from tides to eclipses in language even farmers could grasp. When he described Earth as round like a ball rather than a flat disk, he wasn't speculating. He'd calculated lunar cycles so precisely, his tables predicted eclipses centuries later. Down in Visigothic Spain, Isidore of Seville was building a different kind of ark for knowledge. His etymologies, a 20-volume Wikipedia of the ancient world, preserved dying Latin words alongside the concepts they carried. Need to build a watermill, Isidore listed Roman engineering techniques. Curious about African wildlife, he compiled Pliny's descriptions of elephants who worship the stars. Though riddled with errors, he classified bats as birds, the etymologies became medieval Europe's ultimate cheat sheet, copied in every major monastery from Paris to Prague. The miracle wasn't just in the copying, it was in the sharing. Monastic orders operated like an early internet, with scriptoria nodes in a vast network. A text copied in Monte Cassino might reach Canterbury within a decade, carried by pilgrim monks or traded like treasure between abbots. Irish monasteries became hubs for multilingual scholarship, where monks fluent in Greek, Hebrew, and Arabic annotated marginalia with running debates. In St. Gall's library, you'll find a 9th century Virgil manuscript with old High German translations scribbled between Latin lines, proof that even classical poetry got localized for new audiences. Geography flourished in these cloistered halls. Monks like Dicuil measured Earth's circumference using methods borrowed from Baghdad's astronomers, while the Cotton World map drawn by an anonymous English monk stitched together biblical lands, Viking trade routes, and mythical creatures into a single vellum canvas. When Charlemagne needed surveys of his empire, he turned to monastery-trained clerics who mapped roads using Roman itineraries and star sightings. These weren't just maps, they were visual arguments that the world was knowable, measurable, even if dragons still lurked at the edges. Yet the greatest monastic contribution was accidental. By painstakingly copying pagan texts alongside Christian scripture, monks preserved ideas the Church officially condemned. Lucretius' atheistic on the nature of things survived solely because Carolingian scribes mistook it for pious poetry. Aristotle's works on logic, banned in Paris in the 13th century, thrived in Cistercian libraries where curious monks smuggled them into commentaries on Augustine. This tension between dogma and curiosity would eventually burst monastery walls, spilling into the bustling towns where a new invention called the university was taking root. The shift was subtle but seismic. What began as monks preserving knowledge for God's glory would end with scholars in Bologna and Oxford dissecting that same knowledge for human understanding. The scriptorium's quiet discipline gave way to lecture halls where professors debated whether Aristotle's physics contradicted the Bible. But none of it would have happened without those anonymous figures hunched over parchment, their ink-stained fingers bridging 1,000 years of lost wisdom. Their legacy, a simple truth: ideas are fragile, but in the right hands they are immortal. By the 12th century, something remarkable was stirring in the shadow of Europe's cathedrals, not just the clatter of masons building spires, but the sound of students arguing over Aristotle in muddy town squares. Bologna, Paris, and Oxford weren't just cities, they were cauldrons where the medieval mind boiled over with questions. Picture a lecture hall in 13th century Paris. A Dominican friar named Albertus Magnus towers over his pupils, holding up a piece of amber that attracts straw when rubbed. Observe, he insists, this isn't magic. It's a property of nature waiting to be understood. Across the channel in Oxford, Roger Bacon peers through a lens, scribbling notes about how light bends, while in Salerno, medical students dissect pigs to trace the paths of veins, their hands stained with ink and animal blood. These weren't isolated eccentrics, they were nodes in a sprawling network of curiosity, connected by manuscripts carried along pilgrim roads and merchant routes. What made universities revolutionary wasn't just their curriculum, it was their structure. In Bologna, students literally ran the show, hiring and firing professors with the ruthlessness of modern CEOs. If a lecturer droned on about Ptolemy's spheres without fresh insights, his salary might vanish before the next term. Paris, by contrast, was a battleground between theologians and artists and teachers of the liberal arts who dared to claim that nature operated by consistent laws, not just divine whim. The clash was explosive. When scholars like Siger of Brabant argued that Aristotle's logic might coexist with Christian faith, he wasn't just debating, he was threading a needle between heresy and enlightenment. Astronomy became the ultimate testing ground for this new empiricism. Forget the old image of monks fearing the sky would fall. University stargazers like Johannes de Sacrobosco calculated Earth's circumference using methods borrowed from Arabic Zij tables, while Nicole Orsmy speculated about a rotating planet centuries before Copernicus. Their tools, not just astrolabes but something more precious, a relentless insistence on reconciling ancient texts with fresh observations. When Albertus Magnus described the Andromeda Galaxy as a little cloud visible to the naked eye, he wasn't quoting scripture, he was trusting his own gaze. Medicine underwent its own quiet revolution. At Montpellier, professors taught from Arabic texts by Avicenna and Rhazes, where symptoms were catalogued with clinical precision. The human body, once a vessel of sin to be mortified, became a map to be decoded. Dissections, though rare, shifted the conversation from humors to anatomy. A Bolognese student's notebook from 1380 shows a heart drawn not as a symbolic valentine, but with ventricles and valves. Even pharmacy transformed, as herbals compiled from monastic gardens merged with Islamic treatises on distillation, creating the first glimmers of modern chemistry. Roger Bacon, that cantankerous Oxford Franciscan, distilled this spirit into a manifesto. Reasoning draws a conclusion but does not make it certain. His plea for experimental science, for grinding lenses to test optics, for alchemy that sought laws rather than gold, was radical because it admitted ignorance. Unlike Manville spinning tales of dog-headed men, Bacon demanded proofs. When he described a flying machine or a submarine, he wasn't fantasizing. He was reverse engineering bird wings and fish bladders, convinced nature held blueprints waiting to be read. The real legacy of these institutions wasn't in the theories they perfected, but in the habits they instilled. Universities taught Europe how to argue not with swords, but with syllogisms and star charts. By the time Portuguese caravels began nosing down Africa's coast, their captains carried more than compasses. They carried minds trained to compare Ptolemy's maps with the odd tilt of southern constellations. The printing press would later democratize this knowledge, but the urge to question, to measure, to venture, that was forged in the clamor of medieval classrooms. And as scholars pored over freshly translated texts from Constantinople's fallen libraries, they stood on the threshold of a revelation. The world wasn't just to be read about, but to be taken apart and reassembled, one observation at a time. Technological leaps followed this intellectual ferment like shadows. The same universities that debated Aristotle's physics also refined the astrolabe, turning it from a bulky brass ornament into a navigational workhorse. Shipbuilders in Venice and Lisbon, many of them literate thanks to urban schools, experimented with hull designs that could weather Atlantic swells, while glassmakers in Murano produced lenses clear enough to spot distant shores. Even something as humble as the sternpost rudder, borrowed from Chinese junks via Arab traders, became a tool of empire because sailors now understood hydrodynamics well enough to use it. The line between scholar and craftsman blurred. Leonardo da Vinci, that quintessential Renaissance man, was the heir of this tradition, his notebooks crammed with gears and tendons as if the universe were one grand mechanism waiting to be sketched. When Columbus miscalculated Earth size, it wasn't ignorance that doomed him, but an excess of university learning. He'd read ancient geographers too literally, missing the empirical corrections whispered in maritime taverns. Yet his error proved a deeper truth. The medieval world had cracked open like an egg, its old certainties spilling into something messy, boundless, and alive. The dragons on the map hadn't been slain by knights, but by students hunched over candlelit manuscripts, their quills scratching out a new commandment: go and see for yourself. The compass didn't just point north, it shattered medieval Europe's fear of the open ocean. Imagine a world where sailors clung to coastlines like children gripping a parent's hand, terrified of losing sight of land. Then came this humble lodestone floating in a bowl of water, its needle trembling toward magnetic north. Arab traders had used versions since the 9th century, calling it the floating fish for its wobbly dance. Chinese navigators perfected it earlier still, mounting it on gimbals to stay level in rough seas. By the 13th century, Mediterranean sailors were whispering about this devil's tool that let them navigate through fog and storms. The irony, the same church that once condemned its use would later bless fleets armed with compasses as they sailed to conquer new worlds. But knowing direction wasn't enough. You needed to measure your place on Earth. Enter the astrolabe, a brass masterpiece resembling a spiderweb frozen in metal. Originally crafted by Greek astronomers and refined by Islamic scholars like al-Zarqali in Toledo, it transformed stargazing into a mathematical art. A navigator would dangle it over the ship's edge, aligning its sights with the North Star, then read latitude off engraved scales. The quadrant, its simpler cousin, used a weighted plumb line to achieve the same. These weren't just tools, they were passports to the unknown. Portuguese captains like Henry the Navigator's pilots spent years plotting Atlantic islands by cross-referencing astrolabe readings with Arab star tables, stitching together the first accurate charts of the open ocean. Ships themselves underwent a revolution. The caravel, with its sleek hull and triangular lateen sails borrowed from Arab dhows, could pivot into the wind like a dancer, a stark contrast to the lumbering Norse knars or Mediterranean galleys. Its shallow draft let explorers nudge upriver mouths, while the sternpost rudder, a Chinese innovation that reached Europe via the Indian Ocean trade, gave unprecedented control. Add overlapping planks sealed with pitch, and you had vessels tough enough to survive equatorial storms, yet nimble enough to explore serpentine coastlines. The real magic happened when these innovations collided. A caravel armed with an astrolabe and compass wasn't just a ship, it was a time machine compressing distances that had daunted generations. When Bartholomew Dias rounded the Cape of Good Hope in 1488, he wasn't just proving Africa could be circumnavigated. He was showcasing a toolkit that turned sailors into cosmic navigators, reading the heavens like a roadmap. And let's not forget the unsung heroes, the shipwrights of Lagos and Genoa who blended Norse keel designs with African mangrove fishing boats, or the Jewish cartographers expelled from Spain who took their knowledge of Arab maps to Lisbon's docks. Every beam carved, every sail stitched, was a silent rebellion against the old limits of geography. These tools didn't just enable exploration, they rewrote humanity's relationship with the planet. When Zheng He's treasure fleets dwarfed European ships in the early 15th century, their success hinged on similar tech: Chinese compasses the size of dinner plates, star charts annotated by Persian astronomers, and hulls divided into watertight compartments. The age of discovery wasn't a European monopoly, it was a global conversation, where knowledge trickled along trade routes like rain soaking into parched earth. And as these ships vanished over the horizon, they carried more than cargo. They carried the certainty that the world was vast, knowable, and waiting. Zheng He's treasure ships were floating cities, monsters of teak and silk that made European caravels look like rowboats. Imagine a fleet of over 300 vessels, some stretching 400 feet long with 9 masts and decks stacked like pagodas, gliding across the Indian Ocean like a moving empire. At their helm stood Zheng He, a Ming dynasty admiral who began life as a Muslim boy captured in Yunnan, castrated, and raised as an imperial servant. By 1405, he was commanding the most formidable navy the world had ever seen, his voyages rewriting the rules of maritime power. Forget the lone explorer charting unknown coasts. This was diplomacy on an oceanic scale, with giraffes from Somalia kneeling before the Yongle Emperor and Sri Lankan kings hauled to Nanjing for failing to show proper respect. The numbers still stagger. Zheng He's fleets carried 28,000 crew, not just sailors but astronomers, interpreters, and pharmacists stocked with rhubarb for dysentery. His largest ships held freshwater tanks, floating gardens growing ginger to combat scurvy, and cabins lined with lacquered screens depicting celestial maps. While Europe's knights were jousting in mud, Chinese shipwrights were building hulls with watertight compartments, a technology the West wouldn't adopt for centuries. The treasure these vessels transported wasn't just silver and porcelain, it was soft power. In Calicut, Zheng He erected stone tablets praising harmonious trade. In Hormuz, he exchanged silks for Persian cobalt to glaze imperial vases. Even the animals he brought back were diplomatic messages. The African giraffe was hailed as a Qilin, a mythical omen confirming the emperor's virtue. Africa became a revelation. Zheng He's fleets mapped the Swahili coast decades before Portuguese caravels arrived, recording city-states like Mogadishu where coral palaces towered over harbors bustling with Indian merchants. Chinese chronicles described Kilwa's gold markets and Madagascar's giant birds, likely elephant birds now extinct. A single giraffe gifted by Melindi's Sultan caused a sensation in Beijing, where court artists scrambled to paint this creature with a dragon's scales and a camel's neck. These weren't colonial raids, they were exchanges. Swahili rulers sent envoys to China on returning ships, while Chinese pottery shards found in Kenyan ruins proved trade outlasted the voyages. So why did it all stop? By 1433, the Ming emperors had banned ocean-going ships, dismantling the very docks that launched Zheng He. The reasons were both pragmatic and philosophical. Confucian scholars distrusted the merchant class growing rich from foreign trade, while the treasury bled silver to fund fleets that brought prestige but little taxable revenue. When Mongol threats loomed on the northern borders, building walls seemed wiser than financing ships. Most crucially, China saw itself as the Middle Kingdom, a civilization so complete it needed nothing from abroad. Zheng He's voyages were never about conquest or colonization. They were a grand performance of China's supremacy, and once the audience had applauded, the stage could be dismantled. The irony is breathtaking. Just as China retreated inland, Portugal's Henry the Navigator was funding caravels to probe Africa's coast. Vasco da Gama would later stumble upon Kilwa and Mombasa, finding cities already fluent in global trade, their bazaars stocked with Chinese porcelain, their rulers bemused by Europeans who seemed poor and uncouth compared to Zheng He's polished envoys. The technologies that enabled Europe's age of exploration, the compass, sternpost rudder, and even the concept of naval diplomacy, were refinements of what Zheng He had mastered. His legacy wasn't just in the ports he visited, but in the template he left. The world wasn't a scattering of isolated kingdoms, but a network waiting to be woven together. And as Portuguese sails appeared on horizons the Chinese had once charted, the torch of exploration passed to those who, unlike the Ming, had everything to gain from reaching across the waves. Prince Henry of Portugal wasn't just a patron of exploration, he was a one-man revolution in how Europe saw the ocean. Picture his windswept fortress at Sagres, perched on the cliffs of southwestern Portugal, where astronomers pored over star charts stolen from Arab libraries and shipwrights experimented with hull designs late into the night. Henry didn't just fund voyages, he built an intellectual hub where Jewish cartographers, Genos navigators, and Moorish instrument makers exchanged secrets under his protection. His obsession, Africa's unmapped coast, while other princes waged wars over scraps of European land, Henry bet his fortune on a simple idea. The sea wasn't a barrier, but a highway to unimaginable wealth. The caravels he commissioned were masterpieces of practicality, small enough to navigate shallow river mouths but sturdy enough to brave Atlantic gales. Their triangular lateen sails, borrowed from Arab dhows, allowed them to tack against the wind, a game-changer for exploring unknown coasts. Henry's captains inched southward like cautious dancers, mapping each bay and headland. By 1444, they'd passed Cape Bojador, a point earlier sailors swore marked the edge of the world where the water boiled and sea monsters lurked. The reality, a barren stretch of coast where Henry's men found only sand and silence, but the psychological barrier had been broken. Bartholomew Diaz's 1488 voyage took this momentum and turned it into legend. Battling ferocious storms off Africa's southern tip, his crew nearly mutinied, terrified they'd sail off the Earth's edge. When the winds finally calmed, Diaz realized they'd been blown around the continent's southern extremity without even seeing it. On the return journey, the Cape loomed out of the fog. Diaz christened it Cabo das Tormentas, the Cape of Storms, but Portugal's king, smelling the spices of India on the wind, renamed it the Cape of Good Hope. The message was clear. This wasn't the end of anything, it was the beginning. Vasco da Gama's 1497 expedition was where theory met reality. Armed with Diaz's charts, he pushed eastward along Africa's Indian Ocean coast, where Arab traders had dominated for centuries. The culture shock was mutual. When Da Gama's ragged fleet limped into Calicut, the local Zamorin ruler scoffed at their cheap gifts, hawk bells and striped cloth compared to the gold and silks Arab merchants offered. But Da Gama had something more valuable: sheer audacity. Against monsoons, hostile ports, and scurvy that wiped out half his crew, he forced open a sea route to India's spice markets. The price of pepper in Venice would soon skyrocket as Portugal bypassed Arab middlemen entirely. The human cost of this empire was etched in chains. Henry's early voyages had stumbled upon the Canary Islands and West Africa, where captives were taken as curiosities. By the 1450s, enslaved Africans were being auctioned in Lisbon's markets, their labor fueling sugarcane plantations on Madeira, a grim preview of the transatlantic slave trade. The same ships that carried Malabar pepper back to Europe also transported human cargo, stitching brutality into the fabric of global commerce. Portugal's rise redrew the world's power map almost overnight. Tiny Lisbon became a boomtown where Asian spices piled up in warehouses. German bankers jostled for trade contracts, and shipwrights worked around the clock. The Venetians, once Europe's spice gatekeepers, watched in horror as their overland routes became obsolete. Meanwhile, Portuguese forts sprouted from Mozambique to Malacca, their cannons pointed at rival ships. This wasn't just trade, it was armed globalization, where control of sea lanes meant control of destiny. But the most seismic shift was still to come. As Da Gama's battered ships unloaded cinnamon and cloves in Lisbon's docks, a Genos sailor named Columbus was poring over maps in a Spanish monastery, convinced there was a shorter way to the east by sailing west. Portugal's African route had been a detour, he argued. The real prize lay across the Atlantic, and with that thought, the age of discovery was about to pivot on its axis, hurtling Europe toward continents even Ptolemy hadn't dreamed of. The dragons on the map weren't just retreating now, they were being erased, one voyage at a time. Christopher Columbus set sail in 1492 with a vision so wrong it changed the world forever. Armed with faulty calculations that shrank the Earth by a quarter, he insisted Japan lay just 3,000 miles west of Spain, a miscalculation that should have doomed him. Instead, it led to one of history's greatest accidents. When the Santa Maria's lookout shouted, "Land!" after 33 desperate days at sea, Columbus wasn't gazing at the spice-laden shores of Asia, but at a scattering of Caribbean islands whose existence Europe hadn't dreamed of. His stubborn refusal to admit the truth, even as he noted unfamiliar trees, strange fruits, and indigenous people who bore no resemblance to Marco Polo's descriptions of Chinese merchants, would become the defining irony of his legacy. This wasn't the Indies, it was a doorway to continents unseen on any Ptolemaic map. The immediate aftermath was a collision of wonder and devastation. Columbus's journals oscillate between awe at the Taino people's generosity. They will give all they possess for a broken piece of glass, and chilling calculations of their potential as slaves. His second voyage in 1493 turned exploratory curiosity into something darker. 17 ships carrying not just sailors but settlers, guns, and attack dogs. The Caribbean became a laboratory for European colonization, with forced labor in gold mines and the first encomienda systems laying groundwork for centuries of exploitation. Yet even as violence escalated, the land itself resisted categorization. Pineapples puzzled sailors with their sweetness, hammocks revolutionized shipboard sleep, and tobacco smoke, a ritual Columbus's men initially mistook for demonic possession, would soon curl through European courts as the ultimate luxury. What truly reshaped the globe wasn't just Columbus's ships, but the biological tsunami they unleashed. The Colombian exchange turned the Atlantic into a conveyor belt for life forms previously separated by oceans. Wheat from Eurasia transformed the American plains, while Andean potatoes, once dismissed as devil's apples, saved millions from famine in Ireland and Prussia. Tomatoes revolutionized Italian cuisine, though they were first feared as poisonous in Germany. The traffic wasn't one-way. American corn fueled population booms in Africa and China, while rubber from Amazonian trees greased the wheels of Europe's industrial revolution. But this exchange had a grim undercurrent. Smallpox, measles, and influenza raced ahead of conquistadors, wiping out an estimated 90% of some indigenous populations. The very landscapes mourned, with native caretakers gone, terraced farms in the Andes crumbled, and Amazonian orchards grew wild. Columbus died in 1506, still swearing he'd touched Asia's fringe. The scale of his error became undeniable when Amerigo Vespucci's letters popularized the term New World, and Wald Seemuller's 1507 map labeled the continents America in his honor. Yet Columbus's greatest impact lay in shattered paradigms. His voyages proved the oceans weren't barriers but bridges, ones that Portuguese, Spanish, and soon English ships would race to cross. Within decades, Cortés would topple the Aztec Empire with horses and steel the Maya had never seen, while Pizarro's capture of the Inca Atahualpa hinged on literacy's power, the king signing his own ransom note without understanding the script. The age of isolated civilizations was over. A new era had dawned where a sheep grazing in Castile could fatten a wolf in Mexico, and a silver peso mined in Bolivia might buy spices in Manila, all before the coin's edges had worn smooth. As other explorers rushed to fill the blank spaces on expanding maps, they carried Columbus's unintended lesson. The world was vaster, stranger, and more interconnected than medieval minds had dared to imagine. The dragons were gone. In their place lay real monsters and miracles waiting in the undiscovered country ahead. The moment Columbus's ships returned to Europe with holds full of strange plants and seeds, the world's dinner tables were doomed to revolution. Imagine a 16th century Italian chef staring at a tomato, this glossy red fruit from the Americas, long feared as poisonous because it belonged to the deadly nightshade family. Within a century, that same tomato would simmer into the first marinara sauces in Naples, transforming Mediterranean cuisine forever. This was the Colombian exchange in action, an unplanned global experiment where crops, animals, and microbes crisscrossed the Atlantic with consequences no one could predict. Take the humble potato, dug from Andean soil and shipped to Europe as an oddity. At first, farmers distrusted these knobby tubers until they realized a single acre could feed triple what wheat could, with none of the backbreaking labor. By the 1700s, potatoes accounted for 40% of Ireland's diet, enabling population booms even as reliance on this single crop courted disaster. Meanwhile, maize from Mesoamerica spread through Africa like green wildfire, its high yields making it a staple from the Niger Delta to the Cape of Good Hope. Unlike European grains, corn thrived in diverse soils, allowing communities to push into lands once considered unfarmable. But the exchange wasn't just about food. Tobacco from Virginia became currency in some African kingdoms, while American cocoa beans, once used as Aztec money, fueled the rise of Parisian chocolate houses. Silver mined by enslaved indigenous people in Potosi flooded into China, destabilizing Ming dynasty economies. Even earthworms, absent from North American forests since the last ice age, arrived in ship ballast, altering soil ecosystems forever. Then there were the unwelcome passengers. Disease, smallpox, measles, and influenza leaped ahead of conquistadors, ravaging populations with no immunity. In Tenochtitlan, the Aztec capital, outbreaks killed so many so quickly that Spanish chroniclers described streets ankle-deep in corpses. The Taino population of Hispaniola plummeted from possibly 1 million to just hundreds within decades. These weren't just tragedies, they collapsed entire social structures, making way for European control where resistance had been obliterated by microbes. Yet the exchange also sparked scientific curiosity. When syphilis, likely carried to Europe by Columbus's crew, began ravaging Renaissance cities, doctors were forced to abandon ancient Galenic theories and observe symptoms firsthand. Botanical gardens sprouted in Padua and Leyden, where New World plants like sunflowers and chili peppers were studied alongside Old World herbs. The very act of cataloging these transfers gave birth to early concepts of ecology, as naturalists noticed how species thrived or failed in new environments. As ships continued to crisscross the Atlantic, they carried more than cargo. They carried the seeds of modernity itself. The next time you bite into a slice of pizza or savor a chocolate bar, remember, these flavors are the echoes of a collision that rewired the world's ecosystems, economies, and very understanding of life's interconnectedness. And as European savants pored over pressed American plants and Aztec codices, they stood on the brink of a new era, one where observation would triumph over ancient dogma, and the world would shrink not by conquest but by knowledge. The discovery of the Americas didn't just redraw maps, it shattered the medieval mind's entire cosmic order. Picture a European scholar in 1500, clutching his well-worn copy of Ptolemy's Almagest, confident that Earth sat motionless at the universe's center. Now imagine his horror when sailors returned with reports of constellations unseen in classical texts, or indigenous star charts that placed the sun, not Earth, at the heart of celestial motion. Suddenly, the heavens weren't a fixed tapestry of divine design, but a shifting puzzle where old authorities offered no answers. Copernicus, that quiet Polish canon, was already nursing a heretical idea when Columbus's ships first bumped into Caribbean shores. By 1513, he'd scribbled his heliocentric theory in a private manuscript, arguing Earth revolved around the sun. But what gave him the audacity to defy 15 centuries of Ptolemaic dogma? Partly, it was the cracks appearing in the old model. Astronomers tracking Mercury's erratic path found Ptolemy's intricate system of epicycles, those celestial loop-de-loops meant to explain planetary motion, was collapsing under its own complexity. Meanwhile, Portuguese navigators reported the Southern Cross, a constellation invisible from Europe but crucial for sailing below the equator. If the stars weren't fixed to a crystalline sphere, as Aristotle claimed, what else might be possible? Galileo's telescope turned speculation into revolution. Pointing his spyglass at Jupiter in 1610, he spotted 4 moons orbiting the planet, living proof that not everything circled Earth. His sketches of the moon's craggy surface demolished the idea of heavenly perfection, while sunspots revealed a star that was dynamic, even flawed. The Church's fury wasn't just about scripture, it was about power. If Aristotle could be wrong about physics, might the Vatican be mistaken about doctrine? Galileo's forced recantation in 1633 became theatre. An old man kneeling to deny what his eyes had seen, even as his whispered, "E per si muove," and yet it moves, leaked into legend. The real accelerant for this intellectual wildfire, the printing press, Gutenberg's invention had been around for decades, but now it became a weapon against ignorance. Copernicus's On the Revolutions spread through Europe's universities like gossip, its diagrams of heliocentric orbits copied and debated in cheap pamphlets. Galileo's Starry Messenger, written in vernacular Italian rather than scholarly Latin, sold out in days, its engravings of lunar mountains sparking public fascination. Even banned books found readers smuggled in bales of cloth or hidden inside hollowed-out Bibles, their forbidden ideas fermenting in secret. The irony was delicious. The same ships carrying silver and sugar from the New World also transported crates of books challenging the very worldview that had launched those voyages. A merchant in Antwerp might read Vesalius's On the Fabric of the Human Body, illustrated with dissections that overturned Galen's Ancient Anatomy, while sipping chocolate from Mexico sweetened with Caribbean sugar. The medieval cosmos didn't collapse overnight, but with every printed page, every sailor's report of unfamiliar stars, the old certainties crumbled like a coastline eroded by an endless, inquisitive tide. Gutenberg's printing press didn't just produce books, it detonated an intellectual bomb whose shockwaves reached every corner of the medieval world. Picture a 15th century workshop in Mainz, where the metallic scent of molten type mingled with the earthy tang of printer's ink. Before 1440, books were painstakingly copied by hand, their knowledge locked in monastic vaults or noble libraries. But with the invention of movable type, a single press could churn out 300 pages a day, matching what a scribe might produce in months. Suddenly, the handwritten manuscripts that had taken generations to accumulate could be replicated and spread like wildfire. The impact on travel literature was revolutionary. Marco Polo's once rare account, previously treasured in a handful of illuminated copies, now flooded European markets in cheap printed editions. Columbus himself pored over these mass-produced travelogues, scribbling notes in the margins about golden cities and spice routes. Printed Portolan charts, once jealously guarded by merchant families, circulated widely, their coastlines standardized through repeated copying. A sailor in Lisbon could now purchase an affordable map showing Africa's southern tip knowledge that had taken Portugal decades and countless lives to acquire. Science blossomed under this new regime of replication. Errors that had crept into handwritten copies of Ptolemy's geography for centuries were caught and corrected through side-by-side comparisons of printed editions. Astronomers from Krakow to Cordoba could debate identical star charts, their observations building toward Copernicus's cosmic revolution. Even cookbooks reflected the change. Printed herbals standardized plant names across languages, allowing a German apothecary and an Italian physician to discuss remedies without deadly confusion. Universities became battlegrounds between old and new learning. Where once students had memorized lectures from a single precious manuscript, now they could purchase printed textbooks, underlining controversial passages and debating them in taverns after class. The very act of reading transformed silent, private study, replaced the medieval tradition of public recitation, fostering individual interpretation over received wisdom. No institution felt this disruption more than the Church. When Luther nailed his 95 Theses to Wittenberg's door in 1517, it wasn't the act itself that shook Europe, it was the printed copies that raced across Germany at the speed of horse-drawn carts, spreading reformist ideas faster than bishops could burn them. The same press that had spread Columbus's voyages now disseminated Luther's vernacular Bible, empowering ordinary people to challenge authority in ways unimaginable just decades earlier. Yet this democratization of knowledge had a darker twin, the birth of propaganda. Spanish conquerors printed exaggerated accounts of New World riches to lure settlers, while pamphlets depicting indigenous peoples as savages justified brutal colonization. The press didn't just spread truth, it weaponized fiction, fueling national rivalries and imperial ambitions. By the time Magellan's crew completed the first circumnavigation in 1522, their journey was already being packaged for European readers, complete with woodcut illustrations of fantastical beasts and golden cities. The age of exploration had become inseparable from the machinery of empire, a marriage of curiosity and conquest that would reshape the globe. The race for global dominance transformed the 16th century into an era of cutthroat competition, where European powers scrambled to carve up the world like a lavish banquet. Spain struck first, its conquistadors toppling the Aztec and Inca empires with a brutal cocktail of steel, disease, and psychological warfare. When Hernán Cortés marched into Tenochtitlan in 1519, the Aztecs initially mistook him for the returning god Quetzalcoatl, a tragic misreading that sealed their fate. Within 2 years, the glittering capital built on lake islands lay in ruins, its gold melted down into ingots stamped with the Spanish crown. Down in the Andes, Francisco Pizarro replicated the playbook, ambushing the Inca Emperor Atahualpa at Cajamarca in 1532. The ransom demanded for his release, a room filled with gold, became legend. But the real prize was the vast silver mines of Potosi, whose wealth would bankroll Spanish ambitions for centuries. Yet these conquests weren't solo acts of daring, they were corporate ventures. The Spanish crown licensed conquistadors like franchisees, taking a royal fifth of all plunder, while private investors funded expeditions in hopes of astronomical returns. This mercenary capitalism reached its zenith with the Manila galleons, Spanish treasure ships that sailed annually from Acapulco to the Philippines, linking American silver with Chinese silks and spices in a global trade loop. But Spain's rivals were taking notes. The Dutch and British responded with a revolutionary model, the Chartered Company. The British East India Company, founded in 1600, and its Dutch counterpart, the VOC, weren't just trading firms. They were proto-nations with private armies, mints, and the power to wage wars. The VOC's brutal takeover of the Banda Islands in 1621, slaughtering indigenous nutmeg growers to monopolize the spice trade, revealed a dark truth: empires no longer needed crowns to conquer. Shareholders in Amsterdam and London grew rich while entire ecosystems were remade. Indonesian rainforests cleared for coffee, Indian weavers enslaved to feed Europe's textile boom. For ordinary people, this new world order was a double-edged sword. A Portuguese baker might savor cheaper sugar thanks to Brazilian plantations, unaware his sweet tooth depended on enslaved African labor. An Incan farmer, once subject to communal tribute systems, now faced Spanish overseers demanding silver quotas that sent him into deadly mine shafts. Even in Europe, inflation from American silver-gutted savings, sparking bread riots from Seville to Antwerp. The true legacy of these empires wasn't just in palaces or ports, it was in the everyday rhythms of lives irrevocably tangled across continents, where a cup of tea in London echoed with the clatter of chains in Bengal, and a silver coin in Madrid bore the invisible fingerprints of Andean miners who'd never see its gleaming face. Imagine waking up in 15th century Europe to a world without coffee. No morning ritual of steaming cups, no bustling coffee houses buzzing with gossip and ideas, just ale or watered wine to start the day. Then, almost overnight, beans from Ethiopia and Yemen began appearing in Venetian ports, smuggled past Muslim traders who guarded their monopoly fiercely. By 1650, London had over 300 coffee houses nicknamed penny universities, because for the price of a cup, you could hear lectures on everything from Newton's physics to the latest stock prices. The caffeine rush did more than wake up Europe, it caffeinated the Enlightenment itself, turning tavern brawls into debates and creating spaces where social class blurred over shared porcelain saucers. Sugar followed an even darker path. Once a rare spice kept in locked chests alongside saffron and pepper, it became a global obsession after Portuguese planters in Madeira and the Canaries enslaved Africans to work cane fields. By the 1700s, the average English family was consuming 5 pounds of sugar annually, a staggering leap from the thimblefuls their grandparents used as medicine. Sweet tea, once a luxury for China's emperors, became Britain's national drink, its bitterness masked by Caribbean slave labor. The very taste of modernity, candy, jams, even the gilded decorations on Baroque pastries, was built on backs bent under the lash. Fashion underwent its own revolution thanks to Indian cotton. Unlike scratchy European wool or linen, this lightweight fabric could be dyed in vibrant patterns, sparking a consumer frenzy. French authorities actually banned printed calicos to protect their wool industry, only to see smugglers sell it underground as Indians, the illicit fast fashion of its day. Soon, Manchester's mills were reverse engineering Indian techniques, mechanizing production with water wheels and later steam engines. The demand for cotton reshaped landscapes from Mississippi to Egypt, while the humble sewing needle, now mass-produced in German factories, became a household staple, enabling families to mend and customize their growing wardrobes. Even timekeeping transformed. Spanish silver from Potosi flooded Chinese markets, destabilizing their economy but funding elaborate clockmaking workshops. Soon, European towns installed public clocks, synchronizing workdays and train schedules. The pocket watch evolved from a nobleman's toy to a merchant's necessity, its ticking gears mirroring the new precision of global trade. These changes weren't just about comfort, they redefined identity. A Dutch burgher sipping Indonesian coffee in a Japanese-inspired porcelain cup, wearing a Mughal-patterned robe while checking his English-made watch, embodied a world more connected than any medieval traveler could have dreamed. And as these daily rituals seeped into consciousness, artists and writers began to reflect a planet where the exotic was now everyday, where a still life of fruit could whisper of colonies, and a novel's heroine might fret over her tea-stained silk. The Age of Discovery hadn't just expanded maps, it had rewritten the very script of human life, one sip, stitch, and second at a time. A giraffe posed regally in a Florentine courtyard in 1487, its long lashes blinking at painters who scrambled to capture this living marvel, a gift from the Mamluk Sultan to Lorenzo de Medici. The sketches they produced, some surviving in the margins of manuscripts, reveal more than artistic curiosity. They document a world where the exotic was becoming tangible. Medieval bestiaries had once depicted giraffes as fantastical camel-leopard hybrids, but now artists like Pisanello studied the creature's knobby knees and prehensile tongue, blending observation with lingering myth. This tension between first-hand encounter and inherited tradition would redefine European art. Manuscript illuminations became early laboratories for global curiosity. In the margins of the Hours of Catherine of Cleves, painted in 1540, parrots from the Amazon perch alongside European songbirds, their emerald feathers rendered with the same precision as local flora. These weren't decorative whimsy, they were catalogues of the newly possible. Apothecary manuals incorporated Indian pepper and Mesoamerican vanilla into their floral borders, turning prayer books into accidental encyclopedias. Even maps got creative. The Cantino planisphere of 1502 smuggled Brazilian parrots and West African elephants into its oceanic voids, transforming geography into a storytelling canvas. Literature absorbed these collisions with equal verve. Chaucer's Canterbury Tales, penned in the late 14th century, stuffed its pilgrims' mouths with references to Syrian silks, spice route haggling, and sugared romance's luxuries once unimaginable to English peasants. The wife of Bath's headdress, woven from Ypres and Ghent cloth, wasn't just fashion, it was a walking advertisement for Flanders trade networks. Over in Italy, Boccaccio's Decameron had plague survivors swapping tales of Mongol Khans and Egyptian pyramids, proving escapism now wore global hues. The real revolution came when art became pedagogical. Albrecht Dürer's 1515 rhinoceros woodcut, based on a sketch from Lisbon, though he'd never seen the beast himself, was reprinted for decades as a biology textbook. Its armored plates, though inaccurately rendered, taught generations that truth could be stranger than bestiary's dragons. Meanwhile, Portuguese Namban screens fused Japanese ink techniques with depictions of European traders, their pantaloons and ruffed collars exoticized by artists who'd never left Kyoto. Art wasn't just reflecting connections, it was creating them. By the time Bruegel the Elder painted the Tower of Babel in 1563, the metaphor had new layers. His crumbling ziggurat crawled with laborers speaking a cacophony of languages, a nod to Antwerp's docks where Malay, Quechua, and Flemish collided daily. The medieval world had imagined unity through faith. The Renaissance found it in shared curiosity. The legacy of these explorations lingers in every museum today, where a porcelain vase from Ming China might sit beside a Dutch still life of American pumpkins, their paired presence whispering of a world stitched together not by empires but by wonder. The medieval age of exploration didn't just fade into history, it exploded into the modern world, leaving fractures and foundations that still shape our lives today. Those early travelers, armed with little more than curiosity and crude maps, didn't just discover new lands, they shattered the very way humanity understood its place in the cosmos. When scholars pored over Marco Polo's accounts of paper money or Ibn Battuta's descriptions of Timbuktu's libraries, they weren't just absorbing facts, they were absorbing a revolutionary idea. That knowledge wasn't fixed but endless, waiting beyond every horizon. This intellectual earthquake didn't just end the Middle Ages, it ignited the Renaissance, turning scholars from passive preservers of ancient texts into active seekers of new truths. Science blossomed from these collisions of cultures. The astrolabe, perfected by Arab astronomers and carried home by crusaders, became the key to unlocking the stars. Greek geometry, preserved in Baghdad and rediscovered in Toledo, gave Europe the tools to calculate planetary motion. Even medicine leaped forward when Swiss physician Paracelsus, tired of ancient theories, began testing remedies learned from Moorish doctors and indigenous healers. The printing press, a technology that might have remained a novelty without the flood of new knowledge from global exchanges, turned these discoveries into a wildfire, spreading ideas faster than empires could contain them. But the legacy wasn't just in laboratories and libraries. The spice trade's demand for accurate navigation birthed modern capitalism, with Venetian banks funding expeditions and insuring cargoes. The humble compass, once viewed with suspicion, evolved into a symbol of human agency, no longer bound by divine will, but free to chart its own course. Coffee houses stocked with beans from Yemen and sugar from the Caribbean became the internet of their day, where Newton's laws and Locke's philosophies were debated over steaming cups. The medieval world had been a mosaic of isolated civilizations. The emerging one was a web, vibrating with every new connection, yet this web had dark threads woven through it. The same ships that carried silks and spices also transported enslaved people, their horrors justified by emerging racial hierarchies. Indigenous knowledge, like the Incas' Quipu accounting systems or Polynesian star navigation, was often erased, even as it guided conquerors to new riches. The Colombian exchange brought tomatoes to Italy and chocolate to Switzerland, but also smallpox to the Americas and malaria to the Caribbean. For every shared breakthrough, there was a brutal extraction, a reminder that globalization's cradle was rocked by violence as much as curiosity. What resonates today isn't just the triumphs or tragedies, but the enduring tension they created. The medieval explorers proved that borders are human inventions, not natural laws, a lesson both inspiring and cautionary. Their voyages birthed the modern age of science and connection, but also its inequalities and ecological crises. As we face our own uncharted territories, climate change, digital frontiers, space exploration, their legacy whispers a dual challenge: to reach boldly but carry justice as our compass. The dragons on their maps are gone, but the real test remains not how far we travel, but who we become along the way. Those medieval travelers who dared to sail beyond the horizon or trek across deserts didn't just find new lands, they rewired humanity's imagination. Imagine a world where the edges of maps were stitched together not by satellites but by stories. A Venetian merchant's description of Chinese paper money, a Moroccan scholar's sketches of Mali's gold markets, or a Norse sailor's account of grapes growing wild in a place they called Vinland. Each of these fragments passed hand to hand like precious cargo, chipped away at the old certainties. The world wasn't a static stage for scripture anymore. It was a living, breathing puzzle, waiting to be pieced together by anyone bold enough to ask, what's out there? What's astonishing isn't just how much they discovered, but how little they started with. No GPS, no antibiotics, no guarantee they'd ever return home. Just stars to steer by, rumors to chase, and a stubborn refusal to accept that the unknown was unknowable. When Ibn Battuta left Tangier in 1325, he didn't carry a return ticket, just a pilgrim's faith and a scholar's hunger to see every corner of Dar al-Islam. His 30-year odyssey from the sweltering courts of Delhi to the icy peaks of the Hindu Kush proved that curiosity could be as powerful as any army. Meanwhile, in the icy fjords of Greenland, Norse settlers clung to their turf-roofed homes, trading walrus ivory for German iron, unaware their lonely outpost was the frayed edge of a global web stretching all the way to Constantinople's bazaars. The real legacy of these journeys isn't just in the spices that flavored European kitchens or the silks that draped its nobility. It's in the ideas that hitchhiked along trade routes, Arabic numerals replacing clumsy Roman ones, Indian cotton revolutionizing textiles, Persian astrolabes guiding ships to continents Ptolemy never dreamed of. Every time a monk in Sicily translated an Arabic medical text, or a Ming admiral's fleet returned with giraffes from Kenya, the medieval world grew a little smaller, a little stranger, and infinitely more connected. Fast forward to today, and that same restless spirit fuels rovers crawling across Martian soil, probes diving into ocean trenches, and algorithms mapping the folds of proteins. Modern explorers might carry smartphones instead of astrolabes, but the questions remain unchanged. What lies beyond? How does it work? And what does it mean for us? The dragons on the map have been replaced by dark matter and quantum particles, mysteries just as tantalizing, waiting for new generations to decode. So here's the challenge: history isn't a closed book. Every time you trace a family recipe back to the Colombian exchange, or marvel at how a medieval Arab surgeon's tools resemble modern instruments, you're touching that same thread of discovery. Hit subscribe to keep unraveling these stories with us, because the past isn't just prologue. It's a compass pointing to all the horizons we've yet to explore. Drop a comment below. If you could time travel to any of these medieval crossroads, where would you go? The docks of Malacca, the libraries of Timbuktu, or maybe stand on the deck of a Viking longship, squinting at an uncharted coast. The adventure doesn't end here, it's just beginning.